I really appreciate you sticking your neck out, especially on this question of moving from epistemology to ontology, and I think giving such a good overview on how Deleuze could be incorporated into feminist theory. You know, that this is really still, I mean, you're still breaking ground, so that's so exciting. My question is on, well, I'll kind of start from where you ended on, let's expand and not reconfirm or confirm what we know, we are, and we feel. And my comment is, you know, you said this was an aside about the ducks. And it just reminded me almost of like a Noah's Ark, you know, of like a 2x2. And I wonder about putting sexual difference as this almost natural thing that you know, and why did you move it out of the realm of culture? And you said this really very clearly, that sexual difference is not an invention of culture but of life. And I'm stuck there. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit, because, I mean, on the one hand, it's important if you put it to life that there's, of course, the difference would be multiplied. So why are we stopping at sexual difference at S2?
Because sexual difference is the condition under which all other differences occur, including the variations of sexuality, race, and class. Why? Because it's the only mechanism of reproduction. I mean, that's the simple answer. It's a biological answer.
What about those who can't reproduce?
That's perfectly fine. You don't have to reproduce, but you have to have two parents.
That system.
You have to have two parents. They have two parents. Okay, so I know exactly where the question's coming from, and it's a question that's often raised from the point of view of queer theory. It's a very, very good question. It's a very important question.
Don't speak too fast.
Okay. This is my Australian. Try to slow down. It's because every possible variation of sexuality and every bodily variation is produced through the mechanism of sexual difference. So Darwin talks a lot about non-reproductive, infertile or non-reproductive members of a species adding to the strength of that species. So the point is, we don't have to be heterosexual, we don't have to reproduce. We can be heterosexual and not reproduce, even on Darwin's model. Yet nonetheless, it's the mechanism by which every other variation is produced. And this is Irigaray's argument. It's the means by which, Darwin has this very convincing argument, by which race is produced. But also it's the means by which every form of sexuality is produced. So not every form is reproductive, but it comes from something reproductive, even if it's artificially reproductive now. That's the simple answer. We'll talk more tomorrow about it.
So sexual difference is bifurcations.
Yes.
And
yes.
multiple bifurcations.
Yes.
Instead of converging, go on diverging.
Yes.
Sort of Irigaray was having. I have had that as the fact.
We've been reading your articles from time travels.
Good.
And that's where the question emerged, and now you discussed it more of, and I wholeheartedly agree, of not stopping to focus so much on the subject, identity, but I'm always stuck with what then. So even though you did talk about it, I would really like if you could elaborate on it, and maybe connecting to what you say in your book, that we should focus on categories or classes of action.
Yes.
Which I didn't really understand.
Well, it was what I was saying at the end of this paper too about the final category, that action and acts. My work is becoming more increasingly interested in pragmatism, in the idea of practices, or acts that are undertaken. And it seems to me that instead of what we are, what we do is a much more interesting category. And in part, one of the insights that Hegel provided us, he gave us two insights which are contradictory. One is, I need the other to recognise me, to be another. And the other is, the only way out of this recognition is to work. Okay, he had both of those insights. Now, I'm suggesting that they're in fact incompatible insights, and that either one is governed by a model of recognition, or one is governed by, work is the wrong word, production is perhaps a better word. And it seems to me that one new way of thinking feminism is not to think, am I a woman, but what is it that I do? What is it that I engage with? What are the practices that I undertake that are linked to femininity, whether I'm a man or a woman, for example? And in what modes are they different, depending on whether I'm a man or a woman? These are just the beginning kinds of questions. But what I was hoping to do is to suggest, following Irigaray, that if there are different types of body, and this different type of body leads to a different kind of subjectivity, then there are at least two different kinds of perspectives on everything in the universe. So, I mean, there's a feminist way of doing every kind of knowledge that's yet to be developed. Okay? And what is that? I don't know what it is, but it's not the dominant tradition, whatever that might be. So there's a way of doing subatomic physics from a feminist perspective. I firmly believe this. What is it? It's the alternative way than the dominant way. I can't give it any more characterisation than that. There's an alternative way of doing art. There's an alternative way of undertaking economic relations. We haven't explored and developed these, but I'm happy to call them feminist. And maybe we could call them other things as well as feminist. I don't want to be coloniser. We could call them queer, post-colonial, whatever.
I'm very intrigued about your time concept. You present a time concept in which there's always a possibility that something new is emerging. There is a lot of virtualities in the present.
Yes.
It's a very Bergsonian
Yes.
time conception. Well, you must know that in science in general, the time is usually conceptualized as causal and linear. So that's the way that we usually think about time. What I wonder is why exactly do you use this time concept? If we take it as a presupposition that time is a social construct, then we can choose a certain time concept. And I can understand it because I would say, well, as women, we prefer a future which is different from the past that we have, and even from the present that we have. So we would like to have a better future. But how can we be sure that this, what is it, multiplying forces of difference brings really something new which is better than our present? Why? No, of course. Why are you so optimistic about the evolution or the creative evolution that you defend? You said that feminist theory should invent new ways of opening up the future. And I was wondering, isn't this a causal way of thinking? Where is this new coming from? Is it a virtuality, yes, or should we learn from the past and create something really new?
These are really big questions. Okay, why am I optimistic? I'm actually really seriously pessimist. And in a way, it's only a pessimist that can think the present is so depressing. No, I'm serious. I'm quite serious. This was all written in the Bush years. No, seriously, when there was no political hope for many years to come. And partly I was thinking, how can one go on living like this? You know, if there isn't the possibility of something more. Now, there's absolutely no guarantee that the future will be better than this. Absolutely none. And we know that this is the risk of all kind of politics. That it's a kind of dice throw, a gamble, a leap into the future. But we also know that as subjects who are not as privileged as other subjects, that we have far less to lose by the transformation of the present than those we consider our adversaries. So it seems to me that we have not that much to lose. And more than that, there's a nobility in trying, even if you don't succeed, which is 1,000 times more glorious than the ignobility of not trying. So I have a hope in the midst of this depression that experimentation has occasionally led to something remarkably productive and prolific, unexpected, surprisingly wonderful. I mean, these little moments of feminism, feminism's eruption in the 1960s was such an unpredictable surprise. Or the example that's really clear is that history of art. Suddenly something new happens and the whole world takes off in a different direction. Now, it's the idea of mobilising this kind of hope that I think is immensely important. I don't think I'm overly optimistic. I'm not saying the future will be better. That would be really optimistic. I'm saying that it won't be better unless we make these kinds of risks. I've forgotten the second question. That was the first.
Whether the idea of feminist theory producing
yes.
new ways of opening up
yes.
reality isn't a causal way of
yes.
thinking.
It's not a causal way of thinking. Why? Why? Because causation reduces the future to the present, as you, I think, very wisely put it. What I'm suggesting is this, that we open up forces that we can't contain. That, in a way, I'm suggesting maybe there are causes, but to deal only with causes is to follow them in a predictable order, which is not what any of us, I think, are particularly interested in, unless we're interested in a feminism of redistribution, which, you know, is not entirely worthless. I think it's an important goal, but it's by far not enough. So, what I'm interested in is the idea of how the present is fractured by excesses that we describe as the past. Now, in a causal theory, there's no excess. There's only the efficacy of the past pushing through into the present and then into a predictable future. Now, what I'm trying to suggest through this idea of virtuality is opposed to causation, because virtuality is the potential to be otherwise. So virtuality is another word for contingency, okay, the historical contingency. And it's that historical contingency rather than any causal force that I really would like to open up.
And take the risk.
Yeah.
Well, it links to the previous question about causes, because when I listen to your argument, I keep wondering, don't you take this Darwinism too much as a cause for everything else to happen?
There's no cause. I never said anything about discrimination, causation, nothing.
Okay, no,
Like,
because
where did you get that?
you seem to make quite a strict difference between forms of content and forms of expression.
I didn't talk about that either.
No, you didn't use these terms, but about, well, maybe it also links to the Dutch example.
Let's hear him out. Go on to the end of the argument and then
Okay.
let's see.
Maybe it also links up to the. Maybe I was confused by the example of the Dutch, which was also, I think, mentioned earlier. No, I was in the Deleuze there's always the forms of expression and the forms of content, they parcel one another. So that means that language and concepts and every form of expression is always within any form of content, such as sexual difference in the Darwinist way. If you start talking about the way ducks show a much more the difference, an increasing difference, then I don't see in what way, for instance, art, to give one very obvious form of expression, how art can, well, not so much undo it, but question it.
You mean sexual difference?
Yeah, sexual difference or anything like that. Yeah, it reminded me of a quote in Emile Plateau which says, being a man or a woman no longer exists in music. And the arguments you gave us sound as if you are interested in finding what a feminine music would be like.
No.
Okay, well,
No, I honestly don't know how you got any of that from what I was saying. I don't think I was talking about formal content. I think what I was trying to say is that the distinction between representation, which is structured through forms of expression, forms of content, isn't relevant here. The question of music is complicated because, well, I don't know quite how to answer your question because there are 5 questions sort of embodied in the one question. Maybe what I can say is this. I have a theory of music. I have a new book that's just come out this week. And in fact, I might as well plug it now, and it's on Deleuze, Guattari, Darwin, and I. So it's exactly on this very topic, and I have a chapter on music. It's called Chaos Territory Art. The reading for the masterclass is the first chapter out of that book. It's out last week. Columbia University Press. Darwin says something really interesting about music that Deleuze doesn't say. And what I'm trying to do is not do an orthodox Deleuzean reading, but something that's an interplay somewhere between Darwin and Deleuze. And Darwin says something incredibly delightful, and that is, he says, language developed as a result of the sexual appeal of the sound of the voice. So he says that language developed out of music. And this is Darwin's major dispute with Herbert Spencer, who ends up suggesting that in fact poetry and music are an offshoot of the functional elaboration of language. So the question really is, it's a big question in Darwinism, which comes first, music or language? In other words, is articulation primarily sexual in its origin or primarily linked to survival in its origin? And what's fascinating about Darwin is he argues that music is sexual in its orientation. Now that's not to say it's male or female. That's simply to say that it acts as a provocation and a kind of allure and an enticement. Now, Darwin talks a lot about animals, birds particularly, and the incredible appeal that the sound of the voice has, usually the male bird voice for the female, but sometimes the female bird voice for the male. He claims that this is in fact the origin of music. And he's not the only one. There's now a long tradition. And it's interesting that Deleuze, when he writes about music, refers to Louis Messiaen, whose music is derived from some rewriting of the concept of birdsong. So in Deleuze there is, I think, this really interesting series of links that link it not to maleness and femaleness, not to a specific kind of identity or to a specific kind of body, but to the allure that the two sexes have for each other, let me add in whatever configuration that allure might occur, whether homosexual or heterosexual or boys. There's a quote, I don't know it off the top of my head, but Darwin has this fantastic quote where he says he's even seen crustaceans like shellfish and lobsters vibrating in joy to the sound of music, though they have no ears to hear with, nonetheless their vibratory hairs resonate with pleasure for them. And fishermen have long known that we capture seals by playing music to them. The seals are enticed by the siren song. The ancient Greeks talked about this too. So what I'm suggesting is not that the animal is a reductive explanation of human music, but that we are animals. We are animals. We're complicated, elaborated animals. And the most primitive thing in us is our joy in music, or our joy at art. So music and art are not our highest accomplishments. They are the most broad accomplishments. They are our most animal achievements, which make them our greatest accomplishments. Okay, so art is not the most refined enlightenment capacity of the human being, but the most reptilian. Okay, and I love this idea. I mean, art is about what's most material in us, the base of our brains. And so Darwin, I think, can be used really hopelessly through sociobiology. And what I was hoping to do is to mediate Darwin through Bergson on the one hand. Bergson, who was the earliest anticipator of the shocking bad interpretation that would come of Darwin later. And Deleuze, much later. Those are the two I want to balance, not against Darwin, because he's great, but against the Darwinians.
That this image of seals enticed by Julie Andrews, but it wasn't that sound of music. I often need to disappoint the clarification because we have had discussions like this year, also during the Butler event and the Gatens event, that in talking about sexual difference, part of the problem is how we understand the sexual part. That I think we need to really be looking at the sexuality part of this equation, as well as the difference. And it seems to me that there is a paradigm emerging of a sexuality that deterritorializes, and it's a sexuality as deterritorializing force, and consequently, sex without genders.
Sex certainly without genders. Once we talk about animal sex, this is the joy of animal sex. We don't need to talk about gender anymore.
And then this is a different paradigm of queer theory, I'm looking at Eliza, than what we used to in the Derridian Butlerian mode.
My question is one which we've been discussing. You have in your article identity, sexual difference, and the future. You have the same themes as that you discussed this afternoon about the whole ontology of sexual difference as the force behind change and creativity. What I found interesting is you also talk about your interest in pragmatism. And my question is, how do you see the relationship between almost Hegelian abstraction, in the sense that you're talking about impersonal forces and this ontology of sexual difference as the driving force behind possible change, and creativity as something concrete and is in a certain specific situation where creativity, if you see it pragmatically and if you see it as act, has to arise out of a certain concrete social political situation. And I think, for example, of Judith Butler, who talks about the whole queer scene in San Francisco, and she describes how that is an immense source of inspiration also for the creation of new concepts. And my question is, how do you, well, I think it is, I think, but my question to you is, how do you see this relationship between your very abstract analysis and the concrete, pragmatic change in contingent situations?
Okay, that's a very, very big question too. Let me say first of all, I would never characterise what I've done as Hegelian in a million years. I think what Butler's doing is Hegelian, and I would definitely, I think you're right that I'm really interested in abstraction. And in fact, for the first time in my life, I don't feel guilty about it. I've decided to revel and enjoy the abstract for its own sake. The one from whom I get the notion of abstraction is actually Nietzsche. And in a way, if I were to characterise the difference between Butler's position and my own, it's precisely the difference between Hegel and Nietzsche. I don't think that Judy would deny this in our discussions. I think she's very happy to admit that her work is largely governed by the framework of phenomenology, starting with Hegel. The abstraction that I'm really interested in is the kind of untimely abstraction that Nietzsche elaborated, when he stood as a kind of figure, a critical figure of his time, saying that it's only by having a position slightly out of the ordinary that one can see things that others can't. And he describes it as his classical training. He says, it's because I'm a classical scholar, it's because I love the Greeks that I'm so untimely in the present. It's because I'm so ancient that I'm so modern. So it's this idea of not being properly in one's place that allows one to have this abstraction as a productive abstraction. Now, it's been 100 years since metaphysics revelled in abstraction, and the last great metaphysician, I think, really was Grosz. And he was the last one to do it unselfconsciously, unembarrassedly. The great beauty of Deleuze's book, which I think is profoundly inspired by Nietzsche, the book What is Philosophy, is that it returns to the question, how abstract can I possibly go and still be politically relevant? And that's the crucial question. Not how far away from these questions can I go, but can I go high enough above them to see them from an angle that's really a peculiar angle? And in a way, this is partly the answer to your question too about why Darwin. Why Darwin? Because no one in feminism is talking about Darwin. Why Darwin? Because no one's talking about nature except a few people. Why these particular figures? Because they allow us to see something we haven't seen before, which we know is there. Like, we know we're biological beings, we know we're linked to the animal world, but we wanted to have a theory of culture that places us in one step removed from that. And it's that tradition that comes from Hegel, that culture is the sublation of nature, culture is the unbecoming of nature, that I really want to try and problematise. And the only way I can do it is through Nietzsche, not nature, who affirms that there's something about the abstractness of natural forces itself, including the physics of natural forces, that allows us this untimely, peculiar position. So, am I against social, cultural, historical analysis? Not at all, not at all. But I think it's really important for us to realise it's framed by something bigger than it, that we tend to forget with our perspective only on cultural production. And it's this outside that impinges on us whether we want to or not. I mean, in the last week, we've witnessed more than 100,000 people dying through natural disaster. And the interesting thing about natural disaster is it reminds us how puny we are, what little tiny ants we are, and how hopeless culture is, because culture, of course, is corrupted by humans. I mean, the interesting thing about China and the devastation in China is how many people die from human corruption, which is only ever revealed through this impinging natural force that's greater than anyone can control. So it's this possibility of talking about an earthquake, not simply as a social phenomenon, but also as a natural phenomenon, that I want us to have the right to do. We've done a lot of social and political analysis, and I'm not against it, we should do more and more. I'm not saying anything against it at all. But it needs to have something else as well. It needs to have some cosmological point of view. I'm not saying everyone should do this, but I'm saying some of us should be doing this.
What I want to propose in my comments is a Grossian reading, kind of your own paper. Because in your own paper, I found 2 tracks. First of all, you suggested a reconsideration of feminist problems, the 4 problem areas you talked about. But the other track was really a celebration of philosophical and other masters. And there is, in my reading, there's quite a gap or a disjunction between these 2 evaluations, one really celebratory and the other dismissive, maybe. So what I want to suggest is a reworking of your part 3 in your own terms, actually. Because in your time travel, you claim, and this is a quote, that knowledges and discourses provide the resources for their own undoing in excess of their own conceptual frameworks or requirements. And this is also what you talked about in your paper today. So what this means is that the problem areas in feminism have an access to, and they also provide the resources for their own undoing. And if you say that Butler, for instance, unexpectedly and unbeneficially reconfirms heteropatriarchy, for instance, isn't it the case that you do the same when you celebrate Darwin and Deleuze and Foucault?
We do it differently.
When you, along with, criticizing feminism. So another way of saying this is, can we think the future of feminism precisely through the 4 problem areas that you talked about? Because if you claim that, Butler unexpectedly and for a very short period recognizes heteropatriarchy, then I would say, then I would prefer, for a very short time, as you said, recognizing the work of all the, feminists, all the feminists that have been working on precisely the problems that you talked about. So I'd rather recognize for a while the work of Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett, all the feminists here in the room, Gloria Becker, Rosie Badotti, Rosalie Bijkma, your own work, instead of celebrating Darwin and philosophical masters.
This seems to be a really common view and a ridiculous one. Really ridiculous. Where did all of us get our work from? Now, look, I'm in a particular discipline. I come from the discipline of philosophy. There are, before Simone de Beauvoir, no major women. Okay, none. I'm not saying there aren't female figures, there are female figures, but there are none that are considered by the discipline of philosophy to be major figures. If I were in literature, my position would have to be necessarily different. Can I do this genealogy only with women? No. Otherwise I would. It's as simple as that. Do I need Darwin? Yes. Can I do without Darwin? Maybe, but I can't. Somebody else could. Do these women need more? Maybe. Maybe. Look, do we need more work on de Beauvoir? Maybe. But we need something more than that. And if we simply stick at that, then we repeat over and over again the things we've done for the last 30 years. We both began with de Beauvoir. I don't want to do her anymore. Why? Because I've done it for 30 years. Why? Because maybe someone smarter than me can find another angle. And I know that feminists working on her work are coming up with new angles all the time. I don't want to disagree with you that those 4 perspectives could develop new ways of thinking. My provocation is do it. Do it. Not you, but everybody. Like, if you think identity politics has more legs left in it, then run with it. Show me. That's my provocation. I don't see it. I don't see it in this moment. It may be that in 5 years someone will find a new way of thinking this. My thought was, when I was writing this paper, this is about 8 months ago, what is it I don't want to read anymore because I've read it and read it and read it? And these are the 4 broad areas. I don't want to hear about how we know. I don't want to hear about the limits of discourse. I don't want to hear about who I am or who you are. I want to hear about something more than that. Which is not to say I want to wipe out those traditions. I want to acknowledge historically their importance. But I also want to make it clear that that historical moment isn't as rich as it could be. Like, it's not the claim, don't do this anymore, I wish I had that power. No one ever listens to me. People are still going to be doing identity politics over and over again, ad infinitum. I just don't want to read it anymore. I'm interested in other questions that are bigger than these questions of who am I or who are you. And the bigger question is what comes between us. Right? And that's neither to do with you or I, but some third thing that we don't yet know. Now, do I know myself? No, not absolutely. Do I know you? Not at all. There are infinite questions of a personal kind that one needs to develop about oneself. I'm not talking on that level, okay? But I am talking on the level of the production of concepts. And it seems to me there are 10 million questions we haven't touched yet. Let's try them for a while. Just for a while. Let's see if we can think about the weather from a feminist point of view, or traffic, or pedestrians, or urban planning. I mean, questions that really are interesting.
I can reply on, did you want to come back on the generational issue?
No, what I think is that if you phrase it this way, if you claim that feminism is a discourse that has no excess, then I would say that that's a reductive reading of feminism.
I didn't say that.
No. You claim that the work that we're doing now we cannot do with texts from the 70s feminism.
I didn't say that at all.
Well, that's my reading.
I was very struck how often you've talked about the real, and the ontology of reality, and I'm very intrigued by that. And I think I would almost like to ask for some help. Like, okay, here I am. I'm in cultural studies, right? So I'm always dealing with representations, and ever since.
But representations are real.
Well, let her finish.
Yeah, I know representations are real, but you really ask us to address the real, and you describe it in terms of energies, forces, events, and you did link it to moving beyond representation. And I would be genuinely curious, because I can see your point. I can see your point. I have two questions. And one would be, how, when you are in literary or cinema or fashion or whatever, how do you try and bring those together? That would be an honest question for you, because I have no clue. And the other one would be the real, I was quite struck by your courage to actually address that whole notion, because it seems such, you call it ontology, and for me the real always has those spiritual overtones, and I would find it very difficult to, how do you give the real, and before you know we're actually talking about God, which we didn't need to at all, so that was horrible. I always agree. Yes, so could you wrap it up?
Okay, very good questions too. Let me answer that last one first. It's because I view the real from the lens of someone like Nietzsche that saves me from spirituality. The real is nothing but the conjunction of all forces. Okay, the real is what physics studies. Okay, but let me make clear, physics...
So then we don't have to do it.
No, we do have to do it, because physics does so, and this is in a way my answer to the causal question, because physics does so only ever from the point of view of making the world predictable. Okay, whereas philosophy does so, or any other realm of the humanities does so in terms of making the world livable, which is slightly different. So I don't think we should abandon the real to physics, that's the whole point. Physics represents the real from the angle of its management, from the angle of its rendering predictable those chaotic forces. But the real I'm talking about is not singular, it's not unified, it doesn't have a centre, it doesn't have an origin, it doesn't have a master or a controller, which is why one would nervously say something like that religion itself is a mode of the social attempt, the conceptual attempt to organise the real, according to certain political interests. So it's a real that exists before it's ordered, and that, I think, preempts it from being a spiritual or a religious kind of reality. Now, the question of representation and the real is also a really interesting one. And look, let me be really clear. I don't think that what I'm saying in any way spells the end of cultural studies or the study of film or representation, not at all. It just means that the framework of semiotics and discourse analysis which has governed it is not the only discourse that's relevant to it. And one of the things that I think we all know about something like, let's say, cinema studies, is it's not just the content of the film that one analyses. One can analyse the content of the film if one chooses to, but if you want to look at the film as a rich cultural phenomenon, it's not simply on the level of narration that it works, it's also on the level of its practical functioning as a theatrical vehicle that organises money, that circulates in particular ways. These are all real as well. Now, this is exactly what I think Foucault performed on discourse when he presented that very famous paper in 1972, The Discourse on Language. And his point is that discourse as a representational level is only one dimension. So I think on the contrary, this is why cinema studies are so interested in Deleuze's work. Not why Deleuze's work threatens to close it down. I think culture could be enriched by opening up the limits of culture to exactly natural forces. I don't think this is an end of cultural studies, it's a new era of cultural studies.
I'm Annika Mulder. I worked on Liberterij and on theology. When I heard your concept, when I explained your notion of the concept, and you linked it to virtuality, I thought about utopia. That was affirmed by your notion of hope. And I was wondering if you could explain why hope, and what hope as a gesture or might be for the concept. And from that I was struck by the fact that you devote attention to beauty in terms of art, and the concept as something that is poetic in poiesis, making things possible, making ideas possible, changing reality, also making what you project into the future back into the present. So about beauty, you talk about truth, but you do not talk about the good. So is there an ethical valuation of all those concepts we project into the future? Or otherwise, how is hope related to what I want the future to be? And is not my hopes about the future related to what I think the future ought to be? And the whole notion of ought is about good and bad.
Wow, that's a tough one. and that's sort of got every little facet of the complexity of this paper there. Look, I wrote this paper by specifying what I think the future feminist theory ought to be. Okay, that's what I sort of framed it as. And I don't normally write in ethics. And although I'm interested in the question of ethics has always puzzled me, because I've always wanted to know what kind of force it has. Like when someone says you should, what does that actually mean? In what way does a theory motivate you to do? So I frame this in ethical terms because Darwin and Deleuze don't have an ethical dimension, I think. Really explicitly, they don't have an ethical dimension. Contemporary eco-philosophy attempts to bring an ethical dimension to Darwinism by saying that contemporary species are to be preferred to species of the future or species of the past. But I think what you did pick up is the idea that this change itself, in itself, has no ethical dimension. And ethics, again, this is my Nietzscheanism, ethics comes from the interest and perspective that one has on these changes. Okay?
Yeah.
So, in themselves, I don't think any of these changes are ethical. And it's not that it seems to me that I'm suggesting this is better, this is good, this is worse, this is bad. What I'm simply suggesting is the virtual is nothing but the potential of something to be otherwise. Whether that otherwise is good or bad is a different question. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't have an ethical dimension. I don't know the terms by which the virtual can be ethically judged until it's actualized. Okay, the virtual is the potential to be otherwise. It's It's nothing else than the potential to be otherwise, the infinite potential to be otherwise. Now, should it be otherwise is another question that I've sort of avoided, and maybe there are many other scholars who, because I'm interested in Christian ontology, there are other scholars who've worked in the field of ethics and politics for whom this is the primary question. So I've evaded your question in some ways, not entirely. I think it's a really important question. What would my ethical take on it be? Well, I think I've been very clear. I value innovation over what exists in the present. I value experiment for its own sake.
But
Last round.
may I come back to the Thursday, please?
Quickly, yes.
Well, you evaded my question because you didn't address the figure of hope.
Look, I'm not sure that I didn't address the figure of hope. What I actually said was I hope that feminist theory becomes this thing. And for me, this dimension of hope is the world of politics. There are two angles. Theology talks about hope, theology/ethics talks about hope, but politics also talks about hope. And they're different kind of hope, I think. One is more linked to faith, and the other is more linked to the possibility of action. So what I was trying to do was deal with the possibilities of politics of doing otherwise than we do at the moment.
If I could just I'm sure that this is not what Liz would be happy with, but there is a kind of a Deleuzean answer to this, which is experimenting with intensities and experimenting with frames by which we could actualize them is the ethical project. Whether that gets morally coded as good and bad, see if we care, to cut a long story short, that is the Nietzschean answer, which then we can discuss. And so specifically ethics and not the moral coding of the forces, but experimenting with is the ethical gesture. Daring. And that is also what opens possible futures. I mean, this is what you write. This, in fact, this from your book. Because that would be made impossible if you recognize some of this. Because I'm very afraid that we are drifting towards ethical relativism or nihilism here. It's not. I would be very unhappy with that.
First of all, thanks for your thought-provoking lecture. And I do really have a lot of questions, but I'll pose just one. And that is pertaining to the end of your lecture. And I actually, I don't know if I got it right, so let's clarify that first. That you are saying there are only multiplications of X where we see patterns of dominations. That was your point.
Yes.
And I do have to say that my problem consists in the fact that I still see patterns of domination, and I do believe that they are able to make me relate also to other people in the world without having to see that or to say that this is their subjectivity or whatever, insofar as there are patterns that are more cohesive than other forces. Let's say state as a force is through its institutions always more powerful than the individual, and that is also by contract like that, or a multinational has a different force than a woman working on her field in Nigeria. So in fact, what I don't see is how I can politicize the suggestion that you're making towards the end without having to see everything as an atomized version of life.
Oh, I really disagree with you that the multinational corporation has more force than the woman in Nigeria working in the fields. I really disagree with you, but that's my whole point. That I don't want to for a moment deny that multinational corporations have, state-funded, institutionalized financial privileges over any individual. I don't think that I'm resorting back to an individualism, because I'm not suggesting at all that we talk about people. It's an individualism of acts. My claim here is entirely Foucauldian. It's entirely Foucauldian. And that is, what is patriarchy? What is power for him? Nothing but the local alignment of microscopic acts, which, in their levelling at higher and higher up, form patterns of domination which are not self-reproducing structures. I mean, this is really important. They're not a priori forces. They're not forces that automatically convert. They don't converge. They're not systematic. They're ad hoc.
Okay, but the state is not an ad hoc formation.
No, I never suggested the state was an ad hoc formation. I never suggested I said patriarchy. I said patriarchy wasn't a structure, which is a very different thing. And I don't think race is a structure or racism is a structure. Why? Because it has no form. It has no form in a way that the state does and its institutions do. So, I mean, what I'm suggesting is not that we've been wrong in the past, it's that we haven't been nuanced enough. Our impulses are broadly correct. We understand broad patterns of global distributions of power, but we don't understand them in their nuanced particularity. And the point is, the woman in Nigeria has a measure of agency, not to topple down the multinational corporation, of course not, but to have an effect on it, depending on where she's located and what she does. So, it's an attempt to develop a more dynamic understanding of positionality rather than identity. It's where these acts are located. It's what they align with that depends on their force. It's not who performs them, it's where they're performed and with what effect. And this means that they're not predictable in the way that they function, that they're not systematic in the way they function, and they're not additive in the way they function, all of which are features of the both intersectional model and the model of kind of structural overdetermination of oppressions. So it's not that there aren't oppressions, it's that they're not structures. That's my major claim. Why? Because what I've tried to show throughout this paper is the model of structuralism could be quite readily replaced by a model of acts. This is the pragmatic critique of structuralism. That's my gamble. Is it true? I don't know. This is my gamble. The only way we'll know is if someone attempts to develop a political analysis using something like this pragmatic understanding of acts and seeing how it fails. That's my gamble. I'm not saying I know that this is true. I'm saying I think it may be a more interesting angle on systematic structures of oppression.
To be continued in the masterclass tomorrow. Helene, second last, and then Linda. Who are you?
I'm Helene. I'm Helene, and I'm a researcher at the University of Bologna. I have a short question. If you want to, you can ask more in detail than you did. But have you ever thought of displacing feminism?
I've thought of it, but I haven't been able to do it.
Displacing? Yeah, displacing.
Why would I want to? Is the question.
Yeah.
Is that what you think I'm doing?
No. It's more a question of, because when you have been thinking of the four issues that you brought up now, of displacing inside the future of feminism, it's a struggle I have like with the past months, that you talk about action and pragmatism, and for me, feminism as it exists today, as a content of feminism, isn't a very clear concept anymore. So it might be an option to displace it.
Unfortunately, we don't have that option, because even if I displace this, there could be millions of feminists still around the world being feminists. Look, that's not my goal at all, because my claim about sexual difference, I think, is my commitment to feminism. Sexual difference is irreducible to the extent that there's sexual difference. I think there's always in principle a need for feminism. Whether in fact there'll be a feminism is another question. So I don't care what it's called. I know that all my students say I'm not a feminist, but I don't care if they call themselves feminists. I want them to be feminists. I think it's still really important because that issue is never going to be resolved. Sexual difference is never going to be resolved.
Sexual difference as in deterritorializing force beyond gender. Just an operational word. Are you happy with that? Yeah. We'll continue about political. Last word.
I just want to thank you for the very exciting and inspiring talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about time, about past, present, and future. And I wanted to do that through that sentence that you used, and I thought it was very beautiful. You said the present is factored by excesses we call the past. And maybe with my automatism of being in etymology, I tend to think of it, well, that's how we think about it, but it's at the level of epistemology. But can we think about that past too in terms of the ontology of the past and of ontology of history or of historical forces, perhaps?
I'm sorry. I don't understand. Are you saying, can we understand the past?
Can we understand the past, perhaps? Yes, as the real, as a ontology.
Yes.
And how the real.
Okay, this is a really complicated question, and the simple answer is yes, of course. But both the past and the future are virtual, and only the present is actual. So the past is that virtuality that fractures the present, that enables a different virtuality, which is the future, to come into being. And in a way, this is why it's not determinist, because the past doesn't work as the past directly into the present. The past is already in the present. Every moment of the present carries all of the past with it. Okay, this is what we call history and memory. So the present is never fully present because it's always loaded with this excess that propels it into a future which is different from it. This is inevitable. What politics is the direction or orientation of this towards a particular set of interests. How quick it is another question. The rate of change, maybe not fast enough for us, but like the point is the future is always different to the present, always. But the political question is, how can I make that future in my interests, according to my interests? This is the question of hope.
There is a Dutch philosopher, Frank Ankersmit, who's saying that you can really go back to the past, experience the past at some moments, because the past is never really over, it's still existing. That's different from what you say, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, the point is the past is really over, but it's never exhausted. Why? Because it's continually capable of being reactivated according to every present. I love this idea that the 17th century will never be understood fully. The 17th century is an object for study infinitely into the future. Even if we spend another 10 centuries studying the 17th century, we won't have dried it up. Why? Because it's continually reactivated by the present. We can't experience it as past, we can only experience it as present. Okay?
He's contradicting it.
Yes, no, this is my point, that the past can only be experienced in the present, because by definition, experience is only about the now. By definition, experience is now.
Dear all, time, untimely as it is, forces us to draw this to an end. Temporary only. We have the slogan of the day, nature, not nature. Everybody goes off and writes 1,000 words on it. We have working definition for us, a whole set of new concepts of deterritorialization of familiar concepts. We have hope as the interruption of the repetition of sameness and the platitudes which also litter the feminist archive, if I can use a metaphor. We have lightnings and seals reacting to the sound of music. We have a whole new sort of mental landscape to dream about. Thank you very much, Mr. Wonderful.